Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. North Korea has resumed missile provocations, and the United States and South Korea held joint drills and tabletop exercises. The U.S. also reiterated that any use of nuclear weapons by North Korea will result in the end of the regime. Today, we look at how much North Korea has advanced its missile capabilities and how extended deterrence is effective against that threat.
We did conduct a successful discussion in regards to various approaches on the alliance deterrence posture. And
it is the DPRK that, on the other hand, has only engaged in provocation after provocation and has rejected our diplomatic overtures time and again.
In the studio with me, Mr. Dennis Wilder, professor at Georgetown University. Mr. Wilder was Senior Director for East Asian Affairs at the National Security Council during the George W. Bush administration. Mr. Wilder was CIA's Deputy Assistant Director for East Asia and the Pacific. Also joining us, Mr. Vann Van Diepen, former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Non-Proliferation. Mr. Van Diepen was the National Intelligence Officer for Weapons of Mass Destruction and Proliferation in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Nice to be here.
Now, Mr. Van Diepen, North Korea fired some 69 missiles last year, including 8 ICBM, which is a record number. Did the testings lead to unprecedented level of missile technology advancements?
Well, I think it's really more of a culmination of years of previous technological advancements. Most of those flight tests were actually probably for troop training and operational readiness purposes of deployed systems rather than further developing existing missile technology.
69 testings out of 41 round of testings. They must have made some technological advancements. If you could tell us in order the advancements of those missile technologies.
Well, I think that the main thing it showed was the progress they've made in solid propellant missiles. Most of those tests were short-range solid propellant missile systems, which provide a lot of operational advantages in the field. It's easier for troops to handle. It's easier to conceal those missile systems. They react more quickly. But we also saw the advent of a new intercontinental ballistic missile, the Hwasong-17, which the North Koreans effectively have claimed to have deployed, as well as troop training tests for the earlier Hwasong-15 ICBM, which was deployed probably in 2017.
Now, Professor Wilder, you were at the White House and also at the CIA. If you were still wearing those hats in the government, would you draw up policies under the premise that North Korea has the capability to strike U.S. mainland with nuclear-tipped ICBM?
Well, Ms. Cho, I think I would say or calculate that they have a limited capability. I don't think we're at the point where they have a full-scale capability. I think in the parade we saw, 16 ICBM launchers. That's a small capability. It isn't a massive capability. We have the ground-based interceptors in the United States, so we have some capability to deal with the North Korean threat as it stands today. So for right now, I think you would have to say it's a limited threat. It's one to be taken seriously. Anytime anybody has a nuclear weapon capable of reaching the United States, of course we take it seriously. But I don't think we overreact to what they have so far.
So, Professor Wilder, wouldn't the possibility of U.S. cities getting retaliated by North Korea's nuclear weapons, wouldn't that impact the extended deterrence?
You know, I think you have to remember something, and maybe your viewers need to remember this as well. The United States has lived with the capability of foreign powers being able to strike the United States with nuclear weapons since 1960. By the early 60s, the Soviet Union had over 300 nuclear weapons in ICBM silos capable of striking the United States. We, at times, had very tense moments where there was the real danger of a nuclear war. Similarly, with the Chinese, we have dealt with this for years in ICBMs. And in fact, I remember when a Chinese general threatened us and said, "Are you ready to trade Los Angeles for Beijing?" So this is not a new problem. This is an existing problem for the United States. And so I don't think that it changes our extended deterrence. We have extended our deterrence to Israel, to a lot of other allies, despite the fact that we were facing a Soviet threat or a Chinese threat.
So, Professor Wilder, you talk about the Soviet capability in the 60s. This is the exact reason why the Europeans questioned the extended deterrence of the United States. Koreans have the same question now.
I think, and I've talked to people in the administration, they are taking very seriously what South Koreans are saying and thinking. And certainly, I think South Korea, the president of South Korea and others, have gotten this message through to Washington, that they need more reassurance about the extended deterrent. I would just say, again, historically, our promises to these countries have been rock solid. I don't think you can see an example where we pulled away from our commitments of extended deterrence in the world. So I think South Koreans can be reassured. As you know, there are things we can do to make the extended deterrent more viable, more robust. And I think that the administration is working with the South Korean government in that direction.
Just to add to that, and those promises were not only rock solid, they were effective. The Soviet Union did not attack NATO during the Cold War. We effectively won the Cold War, despite the fact that the Soviets had nuclear parity and even conventional superiority over us, where North Korea is both conventionally inferior and has massive nuclear inferiority.
Would there be, Mr. Van Diepen, a threshold where North Korea's missile and nuclear technology advances to a certain point where United States might hesitate or even decide not to provide extended deterrence, other than the commitment we just talked about, the technical threshold?
Again, given the long-standing Cold War history precedent where Russia had nuclear parity, and there were even arguments at times in the 80s where supposedly they had nuclear superiority, and our deterrent did not waver, its credibility did not waver, and again, most importantly, the Soviet Union did not attack NATO. So you just can't conceive of North Korea getting anywhere close to even that point, much less the kind of point you're talking about.
On that point, after the U.S. ROK Deterrence Strategy Committee tabletop exercises, the United States again warned Mr. Wilder that if the North Korea uses nuclear weapons against the United States or its allies, that would result in the end of the regime. It is the third time that Biden administration put this word in an official document. Is this a show of confidence now that the United States has the military capability to take out North Korean leadership without escalating into war? With all the satellites and the tactical nuclear weapons, are we now have the more possibility to have surgical strike on North Korea compared to in 1994 when the Clinton administration considered surgical strike on the Yongbyon nuclear facility?
Well, if I were the North Korean leadership, I would be very worried about this and take it very seriously. We demonstrated, the United States and the CIA, which I'm very proud of, by the way, demonstrated a capability last summer to take out a leader. Zawahiri, the head of Al-Qaeda, was hiding in Kabul, Afghanistan. We tracked him. We found out where he was living. On a daily basis, sit on his porch reading a newspaper. using drones. Remember, we had nobody in Afghanistan at that point. We had completely withdrawn, so we had to do this all from a distance. At the end of July, President Biden authorized the CIA to take a strike. We took the strike with 2 Hellfire missiles. We killed Zawahiri instantly, but the very impressive thing about that strike is no one else was hurt. No family members of his, nobody else in that household was hurt. I think this demonstrates the kind of amazing capabilities that the CIA and the United States now has. And so if I were Kim in North Korea, I would be very worried when the United States says we could conduct a decapitation strike. We have those kind of capabilities. I've only indicated to you one of the capabilities we have. We have many other tools in our arsenal, and this is a very real possibility only if he uses nuclear weapons and does the kinds of things that, frankly, would lead to disaster for North Korea.
North Korea has fired Hwasong-15s. Does North Korea have the ICBM re-entry capability, Mr. Van Diepen?
Well, this is, we were talking about the ability to have a nuclear warhead successfully survive re-entry at intercontinental ranges.
Right.
This is not something that they have demonstrated in flight testing, but I believe the U.S. government assesses, and I think many analysts, including myself, assess that they would be capable of doing that, in part because they would be able to design a reentry vehicle that was large enough and robust enough to survive reentry, with pretty good confidence.
Mr. Van Diepen, the North Korea having that re-entry capability would heighten the threat level against the U.S. mainland. But even if North Korea doesn't have that re-entry capability, if North Korea brings a submarine and launches a ballistic missile off of U.S. shores, that would be threatening as well. Does North Korea have that capability to send submarines so far and fire ballistic missiles without damaging that submarine?
In a practical way, no, not right now. I mean, first of all, as far as we know, North Korea only has a single test submarine for missile launching. Although they showed what appeared to be a potential operational missile submarine under construction a couple of years ago, that submarine has not emerged from the construction hall. They also keep showing us new and different types of submarine-launched missiles, but the most recent ones we have not seen any evidence of flight testing of. So, whatever SLBM capability they have right now is pretty nascent, but also it's just not a very sensible way for the North Koreans to deploy their forces. The kind of submarines they have right now would be very vulnerable to detection and to destruction by Allied anti-submarine warfare. And the farther you go and the closer you get to the United States, the more vulnerability you take on. So it's much more sensible for North Korea to deploy land-based mobile ICBMs, which can be highly survivable inside North Korea, than to spend a lot of time and effort on submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And it's also more cost-effective because submarine platforms are very costly to build and to operate. They would need a large number of them. And again, all of them would be highly vulnerable to attack.
But since North Koreans are very serious about the development of the submarine and the submarine-launched ballistic missile, if they have that ability, then would that be a game changer?
Well, first of all, how serious they are is very unclear because, again, we haven't seen this submarine emerge from the construction hall for several years. We haven't seen any flight testing of the new models of submarine-launched ballistic missiles that they've unveiled in parades and such. It's unclear to what extent this is sort of a political propaganda gesture and to what extent it's a serious attempt at a force. But no, it would not be a game changer in the sense that, again, they already have the capability using land-based missiles to strike targets throughout the region and now to strike the United States. So the SLBM wouldn't really add very much to that. And again, the submarine itself would be very vulnerable.
I think you have to understand that with ballistic missile submarines, you have to get them very quiet in order to sneak up next to the United States. And I would doubt that the North Koreans have that kind of technology. Even the Chinese have had trouble with quieting technology. And so we would probably detect a submarine long before it got near the American shore.
Now, Mr. Van Diepen, South Korea and Japan both failed to detect North Korea's cruise missiles. But isn't this a grave threat that South Korea and Japan may not be able to detect the cruise missiles and activate its defense system?
Well, I don't think you can draw that inference from this testing activity because the missile was flying in a racetrack or figure-8 pattern relatively far away from Japan and South Korea and close to North Korea. So that's not in order to attack South Korea and Japan, obviously you'd have to fly the missile toward them. So, at that point, the missiles were really too far away for Japan and South Korea to detect them. Now, that said, cruise missiles are hard to detect because they're small, because they fly low to the ground usually. So it's a challenging issue. Now, the United States has some capabilities to use satellites to detect cruise missiles under certain circumstances, and obviously that would be brought to bear in any kind of military contingency involving South Korea and Japan. So, there's no question that cruise missiles, add to the air and missile defense challenge that the alliance faces. But it would not be true to say that they were impossible to detect, nor is it the case that this recent testing somehow shows an inadequacy in Japan's and South Korea's detection capability.
Given the threat of the cruise missiles, some say the cruise missiles should also be banned along with ballistic missiles by the UN Security Council. Do you agree?
Well, in a way, it's kind of a moot point because, unfortunately, the Russians and the Chinese have shown that they're not prepared to support any additional restrictions on North Korea in the Security Council.
If we not consider about Chinese or Russian objections, do you think just the sheer threat of the cruise missiles, do you think they should be considered banned from the UN Security Council?
It's not clear what that would do because obviously North Korea is not going to comply with any such ban anyway. It might make someone feel good, but I don't think in terms of practical impact it's really going to do very much.
Mm-hmm. Professor Wilder, while you were in the government, did you see some indications that from China into North Korea, en masse, large-scale missiles and components going in?
I don't think we can say we detected large-scale activities by the Chinese, but certainly Chinese arms transfer firms are very good at clandestine transfers. So frankly, I don't think we know exactly how much has been transferred by Chinese companies. The Chinese have had a history of transferring missiles and missile technology. We've tried to work with the Chinese on this issue. We've had some success in the past. But companies like Polytechnology Corporation, which began in the early 1980s, are very aggressive arms sellers. And so it wouldn't surprise me that if we ever got a hold of some of these systems, we would find Chinese technology.
Well, one of the big unknowns about the North Korean missile program in general is what kind of support from when, from whom did they receive? It's very clear from the missiles we see that they benefited from various types of foreign know-how and technology. But traditionally, China has had very weak enforcement of its missile-related export controls. It's been disturbingly easy for North Korea and other proliferators to obtain missile-related technologies from and through China. As Dennis noted, this is something we tried to work on the Chinese about for many, many years with very, limited success. And another big unknown is to what extent does the Chinese government know about and even encourage this type of thing? Don't know. But clearly, they have chosen not to devote the kind of resources and priorities to stopping this flow that they objectively need to, and that under UN Security Council resolutions they're supposed to. So, it's clearly a significant problem, but we don't really understand the full scope of that problem.
Do you see fingerprints of Russia and Ukraine as well? And the ICBM, some say ICBM, the entire thing is just imported, and same with the solid fuel technology.
I think that latter is highly unlikely. I think people underestimate the capabilities of the North Koreans. They also tend to forget the fact that now in the 2020s, this technology is actually pretty old. And so it's been around for a long time. It's well understood. It's relatively widely dispersed. Now that said, it's pretty clear that there were some significant inputs of Russian know-how that you can see in North Korean missiles. You can see it in the types of solid propellant short-range missiles they have. You can see it in some of the liquid propellant rocket engines we've seen on their missiles. So there were important inputs to be sure, although again, we don't know what, from whom, when. But the idea that the North Koreans are incapable and they're simply getting entire missiles from other people and that they're rebranding is just not credible.
So did Russian government transfer those missile technology to North Korea, or North Korea sneak them out from Russia?
Again, as with the China thing, we don't know for sure, but certainly in the after the breakup of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, early to mid 90s, it was sort of a Wild West in the former Soviet Union. And you had a lack of centralized control. You had scientists who were suddenly destitute. And so there was a very ripe environment for proliferators to go in with cash and get missile technology, get access to people and know-how, and centralized governments either weren't able to stop them, had other things to do like keeping their countries together, et cetera, et cetera. I think that was probably the period of highest risk. But probably also there's still ongoing issues involving dual-use items that are useful in missiles. And in part this is because the North Koreans have developed more of an indigenous production capability, so they no longer need higher level components like entire rocket engines and stuff. They can make them themselves, but they still need the materials and components and chemicals that you need to make these larger items to then make missiles.
Now, Professor Wilder, with the heightened threat level in the region, there is active debate in South Korea about getting their own nuclear weapons. Similar debate in Japan to a lesser extent. And Australia is getting nuclear submarine through AUKUS. Now, isn't China a country of ancient military strategist Sun Tzu, of the art of war? Wouldn't China already be thinking about this possibility of Japan, South Korea, Australia getting their own nuclear weapons?
Yes, I do think that is distinctly on the mind of the Chinese. I think the Chinese are very worried about the fact that Japan is now acquiring Tomahawk long-range cruise missiles. It's clearly moving from a defensive posture to a bit more of an offensive posture. They have to worry that this is a step down the line. In fact, I hope that when our relationship with China improves, and I hope it does improve, this is one of the topics that we really discuss with the Chinese, because I am of the firm belief that Beijing does not want an arms race, a nuclear arms race in Northeast Asia. And yet, I think that that is a real possibility in the future. And it would be in the Chinese interest not to see that happen, and therefore help us to control the North Korean problem, in my view.
So wouldn't that be a reason enough to be a leverage, a pressure point against China and North Korea, the debate and discussion about South Korea getting their own nuclear weapons?
Absolutely. I think that the Chinese need to understand that public opinion is moving in that direction, that the governments in Japan and South Korea, who may be more reluctant to move down this road, may think about the option that the Israelis, for example, have taken, where you don't disclose the program, but you create the capabilities, you create the necessary infrastructure without necessarily deploying a system. And I think that could be a real possibility in the future, particularly, as we've discussed, if there's some concern that the American extended deterrence isn't as viable as it once was. So I think this is a very important issue, and the administration needs to bring it up with the Chinese in a serious way.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Mr. Van Diepen, Professor Wilder, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.